In 1966, singer David Houston became a moral icon in America with just one song. His massive hit, Almost Persuaded, a dramatic story of temptation and fidelity, launched him to the heights of fame and portrayed him as a model husband. But the man behind the legendary voice was far more complex. Few know that this baritone was a direct descendant of two legendary figures in American history, Sam Houston and General Robert E. Lee. He conquered the highest peaks of country music, becoming a prestigious member of the Grand Ole Opry, only to quietly watch his career fade as musical tastes changed. And true tragedy struck when his life ended suddenly and silently at the age of 57, leaving behind an unfinished legacy and countless unanswered questions. This is the untold story of the life, illustrious career, and tragic death of one of country music's forgotten golden voices. David Houston was born in 1935 in Bossier City, Louisiana, a land in the deep American South where the air is thick with humidity and history is present in every inch of soil. His life was born from American history itself, a story that began long before he ever sang a note. He was a man who reached the absolute pinnacle of his profession, only to watch the musical world he had mastered begin to disappear around him. He was not merely a Southern boy, he carried an extraordinary lineage. His family name carried weight, rooted in both Sam Houston, hero of Texas independence, and Confederate Commander Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Confederate Army. Growing up in the shadow of such colossal legacies quietly shaped David's character. It instilled in him a sense of dignity, a calm demeanor, and a measured classic style that would later permeate his music. He was not a rebel. He was a gentleman from a young age. To understand David Houston, you have to go back to the deep, humid South, to the soil of Bossier City, Louisiana, where he was born in 1935. This wasn't just any family in any southern town. The name Houston carried weight. David was a direct descendant of two of the most mythic figures in American history, Sam Houston, the legendary general and first president of the Republic of Texas, and on his mother's side, the Confederate General Robert E. Lee. He was born into a legacy of leaders, of men who shaped the very map of the country. It was a formidable heritage, a silent expectation of greatness that hummed in the background of his entire life. Growing up during the tail end of the Great Depression and through the Second World War, his world was shaped by hardship and resilience, but it was also filled with music. Just across the Red River from his home was Shreveport, the headquarters of a radio show that was a universe unto itself, the Louisiana Hayride. It was the cradle of stars, the place where a young Elvis Presley would first gyrate his way into history, where Hank Williams would pour out his heartache. For a boy like David with a natural gift for singing, the Hayride wasn't just entertainment. It was a beacon, a possibility. He joined the show as a teenager, sharing the stage with the very legends he idolized. It was here that he learned his craft, not in a classroom, but on a stage where authenticity was the only currency that mattered. If the audience didn't believe you, they'd let you know. David learned early on how to make them believe. His surroundings also played a crucial role. Nearby Shreveport was home to the Louisiana Hayride, the cradle of stars, where Elvis and Hank Williams made history, and where Houston learned to master a stage. This was not just an entertainment program, but the cradle of stars, the launchpad for the greatest names like Hank Williams and Elvis Presley. For a teenager with a gifted voice like David, the Hayride was his musical university. He joined the show at a very young age, sharing the stage and breathing the same air as his idols. It was here that he learned the most important lesson: how to connect with an audience, how to turn a song into a truthful story that listeners had to believe. The combination of his historical lineage and practical stage experience created a unique artist who embodied both the dignity of the past and the sincerity of country music. After a brief stint in the Army, he knew music was his only path. Like so many hopefuls before him, he packed his bags and headed for the one place where country music dreams were forged into reality: Nashville, Tennessee. But Music City in the early 1960s was a tough town to crack. It was a sea of aspiring singers, all with a guitar and a handful of songs, all hoping for that one lucky break. Houston had a few minor successes, including a song called Mountain of Love in 1963, which gave him a taste of the charts. But it wasn't enough to make him a star. He was just one more talented voice in a city full of them, playing in small clubs, grinding it out, and waiting. His moment, it seemed, might never come. And then he met a man who would change not only his life, but the very sound of country music itself: the visionary producer Billy Sherrill. Sherrill was an architect of sound. He was a key figure in creating what became known as the Nashville sound, a new style of country music that sanded off the rough, twangy edges of honky-tonk and replaced them with lush strings, soulful background vocals, and a polished, sophisticated production that could cross over to pop radio. Sherrill wasn't just looking for singers, he was looking for storytellers. He was looking for voices that could carry the weight of complex adult emotions. In David Houston, he found his perfect instrument. David Houston's career is a dramatic story of a rise to the peak and a quiet fade, centered on a fateful song that both created and imprisoned him. After his early years struggling in Nashville, the turning point in David Houston's life came when he met the brilliant producer Billy Sherrill. Sherrill didn't just hear a good voice. He saw a born storyteller. He became the sonic architect of Houston's career, polishing and building a sophisticated, emotional musical style known as the Nashville sound. Houston's performance turned the song into a cultural earthquake. It not only topped the country charts for 9 weeks, but also won 2 Grammy Awards, launching David Houston into superstardom. A series of other hits followed, such as With One Exception and You Mean the World to Me, proving he was no one-hit wonder. The pinnacle of his glory came in 1972 when he was invited to become a member of the Grand Ole Opry, an immortal affirmation in the cathedral of country music. In the 70s, his career continued to shine with successful duets with Barbara Mandrell. However, as musical tastes shifted in the late 70s and 80s, Houston's career began to stall. The gritty outlaw music of Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson, and later the polished urban cowboy style, made his calm narrative music feel out of place. The greatest tragedy of his career was the shadow of Almost Persuaded. This great song was both a launch pad and a gilded cage. It defined his image so perfectly that the public could hardly accept him in any other role. He was forever the man in the song Almost Persuaded. And when the world no longer needed that story, his star quietly faded. In 1966, Sherrill and his songwriting partner Glenn Sutton wrote a song that was more like a short film than a pop tune. It was a detailed first-person narrative about a married man out for a drink. The music swells as a woman asks him to dance. The lyrics are a blow-by-blow account of his internal struggle. Then I looked in her eyes and I saw it there, the love that I'd been waiting for. You can feel the pull, the magnetic force of temptation. The song builds to a fever pitch of indecision. He's about to leave with her, to throw everything away for a moment of passion, and then, at the climax, he catches a glimpse of his own reflection In the mirror, and on his hand the wedding band. The spell is broken. I was almost persuaded, he sings, the relief and regret hanging heavy in his voice as he leaves the bar alone. Sherrill knew this song needed a special kind of performance. It couldn't just be sung. It had to be acted. It required a voice that could convey vulnerability, desire, and ultimately a powerful sense of moral conviction. He called David Houston into the studio. What happened in that recording session became the stuff of Nashville legend. Houston didn't just sing the words, he inhabited them. He lived through that moment of weakness and found his strength. When he delivered the final spoken word part of the song, it felt less like a lyric and more like a hushed private thought. The session musicians in the room reportedly fell silent, knowing they had just captured lightning in a bottle. When Almost Persuaded was released, the public reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. It wasn't just a hit, it was a phenomenon. It shot to #1 on the country charts and stayed there for 9 solid weeks, a record at the time. It crossed over to the pop charts and won 2 Grammy Awards. The song resonated so deeply because it spoke to a universal human experience, the battle between who we are and who we are tempted to be. It was an honest song for an era that was becoming increasingly complicated. In a time of social upheaval and changing moral landscapes, Almost Persuaded was a powerful ode to fidelity, a defense of the quiet, everyday heroism of staying true. And David Houston, the humble singer from Louisiana, was suddenly one of the biggest stars in America. The song was a rocket, and he was strapped to the front of it. Overnight, David Houston's life was transformed. He was no longer playing to half-empty clubs. He was headlining sold-out shows across the country. He became a fixture on television, his calm, dignified presence a familiar sight in millions of living rooms. The hits kept coming. Songs like With One Exception, You Mean the World to Me, and Have a Little Faith all followed Almost Persuaded to the top of the charts. They were classic Billy Sherrill productions, sweeping, dramatic, and emotionally charged, and Houston's voice was the anchor that held it all together. He had found his sound, his niche, and for the rest of the 1960s, he was an unstoppable force in country music. His personal life seemed to mirror the wholesome image of his most famous song. He was a dedicated family man, married to his wife, Joyce, and a father to their 2 children. In interviews, he came across as gentle, thoughtful, and deeply committed to the values he sang about. He was the quintessential country gentleman. In 1972, he received the highest honor the genre can bestow. He was invited to become a member of the Grand Ole Opry. Standing on that sacred stage in the circle of wood taken from the original Ryman Auditorium was the culmination of everything he had worked for. It was a validation that he belonged among the immortals of country music. But the life of a touring musician is a grueling one. It's a relentless cycle of highways, hotel rooms, and concert halls. A life lived out of a suitcase far from the comforts of home. The very thing that made him a star, his music, constantly pulled him away from the family that grounded him. While his songs often celebrated the sanctity of home and marriage, the reality of his career made living up to that ideal a daily challenge. There was a quiet tension between the public persona of David Houston, the unwavering symbol of fidelity, and the private man who had to navigate the inherent loneliness and temptations of the road. This internal conflict was never a public scandal. Houston was a deeply private person, not one to air his struggles. But the strain was real, and eventually, his marriage to Joyce ended in divorce. It was a quiet heartbreak, away from the headlines, but it added a layer of profound irony to his career. The man who had given voice to the triumph of marital loyalty had found himself unable to sustain his own. It didn't make him a hypocrite. It simply made him human. It underscored the painful truth that the simple morality of a 3-minute song is often no match for the complexities of a real life. As the 1970s wore on, the musical landscape began to shift beneath his feet. The lush, string-laden Nashville sound that he and Billy Sherrill had perfected was starting to give way to new movements. The outlaw country of Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson brought a raw, gritty edge back to the genre. Later, the urban cowboy craze brought a pop-infused, disco-influenced sound that was a world away from the heartfelt ballads that had made Houston famous. He continued to record and have success, particularly with a series of popular duets with a young rising star named Barbara Mandrell. Their chemistry was undeniable, and songs like After Closing Time and I Love You kept him on the radio. But the solo chart-topping hits became fewer and farther between. He was still a beloved member of the Opry, a respected veteran, but the momentum had slowed. He was an artist defined by a certain time and a certain sound, and as that time passed, he found himself slightly out of step. This wasn't a unique story. Many stars of the 50s and 60s faced a similar fate as tastes changed. But for Houston, the challenge was compounded by the sheer size of Almost Persuaded. The song wasn't just his biggest hit, it was a cultural landmark. It was both the foundation of his career and a cage he could never quite escape. Every new song was measured against it. Every performance was expected to include it. It was the first thing people thought of when they heard his name. Being defined by a single, perfect moment is a strange kind of fame. It guarantees you will never be forgotten, but it can also prevent you from ever truly moving on. There were no major controversies in David Houston's career. You won't find stories of drunken rampages or public meltdowns. He was, by all accounts, a consummate professional and a kind man. The debate surrounding his legacy is far more subtle and, in some ways, more tragic. It's the question of why a talent so immense became so narrowly defined in the public memory. Was he a victim of his own success? Or was he a casualty of the music industry's relentless churn, always looking for the next new thing? Perhaps the most compelling interpretation is that Houston represented a type of masculinity and a set of values that were fading from the mainstream. His songs were about adults grappling with adult problems, commitment, temptation, regret, and faith. He sang about the quiet drama of ordinary life with an extraordinary voice. In a world that was becoming louder, faster, and more cynical, his brand of earnest, heartfelt storytelling began to feel like a relic from another time. He wasn't an outlaw or a pop crossover star. He was a balladeer, a crooner in a cowboy hat, and the world was moving in a different direction. He never stopped working. Throughout the 1980s, he continued to tour, playing to loyal fans at the Opry, at state fairs, and in theaters across the country. His voice, if anything, had grown richer with time, imbued with a depth that only comes from a life fully lived. But he wasn't a chart topper anymore. He was a living piece of country music history, a beloved figure who represented the golden age of the Nashville sound. He seemed content with his role as an elder statesman, even if it had come a bit earlier than he might have hoped. Then in the early 1990s, a shadow began to quietly fall over David Houston. At first, they were small, almost imperceptible signs that friends and family tried to ignore. Occasionally in conversation, he would seem disoriented, his gaze distant, as if he were somewhere far away even while standing in the middle of a room. His voice, that perfectly tuned instrument, would sometimes slur, losing its clarity. The control and precision that were the hallmarks of his singing would sometimes desert him in daily conversation, a cruel irony for a man whose identity was so tied to his voice. The man who was always so calm and reliable on stage was becoming alarmingly unpredictable in his personal life. And then, one day in November 1993, that shadow took form. As he prepared for a show, a routine he had performed thousands of times, his body betrayed him. He collapsed. The fall didn't happen on a grand stage under bright lights, but backstage in a mundane moment, which made it all the more brutal. He was taken to a hospital in his hometown of Bossier City. The circle of life had brought him back to where it all began, not for a triumphant return, but to fight for his life. The diagnosis was cruel and non-negotiable, a ruptured brain aneurysm. A silent thief had been growing inside him, unknown to anyone. For one long week, David Houston lay in a coma, suspended between life and death. In Nashville and across the country music world held its breath. Prayers were whispered in the dressing rooms, at the Grand Ole Opry, and anxious phone calls were exchanged among the legends of his generation. Everyone hoped for a miracle for the man with the golden voice, but the miracle never came. On November 30th, 1993, David Houston passed away. He was only 57 years old. When the news broke, a stunned silence fell over Nashville, followed by a wave of profound grief. His death was not the anticipated passing of a man who had lived a full life. It was an abrupt interruption, a tragic shock. 57 is no age for legends to die. It is a ripe age for reflection, when they should be receiving lifetime achievement awards, becoming respected elders who mentor young artists and enjoy the fruits of a long and storied career. His death cruelly cut the story short, leaving a final, lingering, unanswered question. What else might he have given us? The greatest tragedy of his passing is that he missed a potential revival. It was in the 1990s that country music was experiencing a new boom, and audiences were beginning to rediscover the core values and golden voices of the previous generation. He never had the chance for a late career comeback, never had his own American recordings moment, like Johnny Cash did with Rick Rubin, a rebirth that redefined his entire legacy. He never had groundbreaking collaborations with a new generation of artists like Loretta Lynn did with Jack White. He never wrote a memoir to share the stories behind the songs, or to see his music discovered and celebrated by a new generation. He was simply gone, leaving a void. It wasn't just a void in the Opry's membership roster or on the radio waves. It was a void in the very fabric of country music. The voice that once filled the air with stories of choice, temptation, and regret was now silent, leaving behind an unfinished story that no one else could write. We should remember a boy from Louisiana with the blood of American legends who turned a hayride dream into reality. We should remember the persistent artist who found his fateful voice inside a Nashville studio, creating an immortal moment of magic. And we should remember the gentleman of the Opry stage, a man who maintained his composure and dignity even as the musical world around him changed forever. Because in the end, the story of David Houston isn't just about a song. It's about the quiet strength it takes to walk a fine line, the line between temptation and faith in a dim tavern, and the line between art and commerce under the bright stage lights. He used his voice to tell of the simple struggles and triumphs of life, and he did it with a rare grace and sincerity. His life may have closed too soon, but that voice and the stories it tells will last forever. More than a singer, he was a storyteller. And his story, much like his most famous song, is a testament to integrity, to quiet conviction, and to a man who, in the end, was never persuaded to be anyone but himself.